Microtransactions are spreading around the industry I love, like syphilis in a hippie commune. And much like said commune, everyone involved seems to be a little skeezy and smells a bit funny. While this is not exactly news in the industry, or even a new idea in general, the weight and level of intrusion that these microherpes have gotten is to the point that even normies are starting to take notice. Now, let me start by saying that this is not a new topic. If you've been watching any channel dedicated to gaming, you've likely already heard about games such as Battlefront 2, Destiny 2, and Forza 7 taking the concept of loot boxes into new depths of depravity. But for those viewers of mine who are not aware of this phenomenon, I will quickly explain what's going on. Now I have to break here and say that it's the loot box system itself and not microtransactions in general that I'm hitting on in this video. There are several games that have microtransactions that I personally don't mind. Warframe, for example, allows you to outright purchase new frames and weapons in the game, and most of the prices for these items, along with what you get with them, are actually fairly reasonable. Said game also doesn't allow everything to be outright bought, as many items can only be attained in-game through events and through players. Players are free to trade items in-game, including the premium currency, and even if one were to purchase every item in the game, they'd arguably have little to no advantage to players who spent no money at all. I will also admit that games like this are rare and the balance that they have is very precarious. I'm also not talking about DLC for games, as I'll be doing a separate video on the subject. My focus on this video is the topic of loot boxes, aka loot gate. Everything these days has gate at the end of it, so why not this? Essentially, loot boxes are randomized prize chests that contain various weapons, skins, characters, or whatever else that particular game wants to put into them. Most games that have them give you a loot box every time you level or rank up, and give you a small selection of loot from the game. While many loot boxes contain only cosmetic items, arguably just as if not more important to players than power items, many other games include such items as weapons, characters, and upgrades in these boxes. Now this wouldn't be a problem if that were the end of the system. Everyone would be tied to an RNG leveling system, nobody would have any edges over anyone else, and obtaining these items would be directly tied to time played in the game. Now while the system would be extremely annoying due to RNG, nobody can really make a legit claim that the game was unfair. Unbalanced, yes, but again, it would all come down to luck. Loot boxes as they stand in most games today, however, aren't just earned through levels and ranks. You see, the boxes you get from ranking up are merely a taste test, a little teaser for players. A dropper full of water as you walk through the desert, one could say. You see, the real issue with loot boxes lay in the fact that most games don't just allow these loot boxes to be purchased, but encourage you to do so with real money. In fact, at the time of writing this video, I can't think of a single loot box based game that doesn't allow you to buy loot boxes. Loot boxes as they stand today allow people to spend several $100s, not including the core price of the game, to achieve the same results that hours of grinding and practicing in a game used to achieve. Take Shadow of War, a game that, from what I understand, is actually quite enjoyable to play right up until the end of the game. In the game, you have one of two choices for the end of the game. Either play it, grinding for hours to obtain rare orcs, or purchase Loot Crate and hope to obtain them that way. Now, while I may not be 100% accurate on the details of the in-game orcs, this is essentially how it's described by those who play it or watch it played. Now, before you get your panties in a bunch with your yells of, "Well, you didn't even play the game," and the like, yeah, you're right. Not only did I not play Shadow of War, I have no desire to play it or any other game involving loot crates. In fact, the last game I played that had loot crates was Destiny 2, and by the time we knew about them, we had already pre-ordered 4 copies for my company. Also, to date, the Destiny 2 loot crates haven't had an impact on gameplay. However, the game itself turned out to have about 50 other major issues that would have overshadowed loot crates, even if they were packed full of weapons and subclasses. Loot boxes, as described by Sid Alpha and Jim Sterling Senpai, are essentially gambling shoved into video games. While the current legislation currently doesn't classify loot crates as gambling, I suspect that will change at some point in the future, causing any such game to have them to get an automatic rating of A for adult. Until that time, loot crates are here, and they fall into 2 main categories: single and multiplayer. Now, single player loot boxes are a bit of an anomaly, as the existence of paid loot boxes in a game such as this is really just cutting down on the amount of time a person would need or even want to play the game. With no PvP or multiplayer function, single player loot boxes are essentially cheat codes to help a player progress through the game faster and with less difficulty. Oh sure, I could go through the intricacies of exactly what each single player game offers in the way of loot boxes, but overall they're just paid cheat codes. Now, having to cheat one's way through a game is another topic for another time, and in a single player game really has no downside on the community as a whole. If a person wants to cheat their way through a game, really it's their own business. However, Taking that option away and hiding it behind a random paywall is a pretty shitty thing to do. Multiplayer loot crates, however, are a whole other matter. You see, in most multiplayer games, there's an aspect of competition to them. Whether there is direct competition in the form of PvP, or whether it's more psychological in the form of cosmetics, multiplayer hosts the worst instances of online gambling exploitation there is. You see, while loot boxes and microtransactions may have started off as merely cosmetic, they've now begun to directly affect core gameplay of games. Take Battlefront 2, where your character's power and abilities were tied directly to what you got from the loot boxes. Reading through the upgrades obtained only through the loot boxes, one could see that anyone who paid, say, $100 for loot crates would have a distinct advantage over someone who didn't pay for them at all. Now, keep in mind that at the time of writing this, Battlefront 2 has apparently started changing their loot box system and tying character progression to actually playing the character, but the damage has already been done. See, even if the system's changed now, the idea of pay to win, a concept that was up to this point restricted really only to free-to-play mobile games, it snuck its filthy head in the AAA industry. Even if the loot crates in this game are merely cosmetic at this point, soon enough a new publisher will introduce the pay-to-win mechanic into their game and keep it there. In fact, soon enough games will come out that cost the industry standard of $60 to buy, but will be totally reliant on loot boxes for progression for its multiplayer competition soon enough. Already, Activision has filed 2 separate patents for microtransaction systems, and I won't be surprised to see it or other companies patent loot box oriented patents in the future as well. Soon enough, games will exist from other AAA companies whose experience solely relies on how much more money you're willing to pump in the game. Now, here's where I have to diverge from what every other person covering this topic says. Right about here, independent journalists talk about how microtransactions and loot boxes in AAA games are here to stay, but I have a bit of a different take on the subject. You see, I do not believe, if current gaming industry trends and regulations stay as they are, that loot boxes are here to stay. In fact, I think they'll be gone within the next couple of years, and I believe the idea of loot boxes will become so toxic that microtransactions themselves will become an automatic way to ensure your game tanks on announcement. Allow me to explain. You see, microtransactions are not a new concept in gaming. While they are prevalent in free-to-play games, it's only the AAA industry that has really had a rise in them lately. $60 games that require more and more money to really get everything the game has to offer. Once again, I'm not talking about DLC or long-term MMOs such as World of Warcraft or Star Wars The Old Republic in this, as DLC games will be covered by me at a later date. You see, pay-to-win games are nothing new, and many such games have existed in the last decade or so on non-AAA titles as well as in the mobile market. However, there is generally a single huge difference in pay-to-win games and AAA titles that sport these microtransactions. And that difference is the initial price of the game. While certain political and social commentators may have different things to say about capitalism and the free market, video games remain relatively unchanged in their general purpose and why they're bought and played. Entertainment. You see, unlike say a car or a house or even food and utilities, video games are not something that are needed in one's life outside of, say, a game critic or a journalist's career. Games are completely optional to buy and play, and generally, if we don't like a game, we don't buy it, or we get a refund for it, and we especially encourage others not to play or buy it. Now, you may be asking where I'm going with this, but just follow me. People play games to be entertained, and generally, outside of a few personality types whose nature makes them susceptible to the allure of loot crates and microtransactions, most people don't want to have to shell out extra cash on a product they already paid for. Imagine if you bought an iPhone and a plan, but had to pay an extra $1 for every number you saved to your phone. Or imagine spending hundreds of thousands on a house, but had to buy extra loot crates in hopes of getting all the doors, windows, and the roof to go along with it. See, loot crates are designed to prey on people with addictive personalities that would spend thousands of dollars on the game, or whales as the industry calls them. See, the loot crate and microtransaction system doesn't exist for the general public's use. They exist for the people who are willing to spend a ton on them, people who can't resist them. While these systems may be a core mechanic around a game, that mechanic only exists for maybe 1 out of every 100 or so people to really use. In other words, most pay-to-win games, whether AAA, mobile, or indie, are really only made for that fraction of people. Now, that may work for free-to-play games and mobile games, but this is where the initial price of a game comes into play. You see, as I mentioned before, I refuse to buy, play, or even watch someone else play Shadow of War simply due to the loot crate system. And if Destiny 2 doesn't wise up, I'll completely stop playing it as well. This includes, by the way, the broken game Ingram system, but again, topic for another video. Now, I'm not saying this is some kind of protest or as a moral arbiter against a loot crate system. I'm saying this as a gamer who doesn't want to drop more money on a game than in the initial cost of said game. If I can't compete or progress in a game simply because I don't want to buy extra stuff in a game, then the game isn't worth my time or money. It doesn't matter how cool the game looks, how good the graphics are, how great the gameplay is. If I can't enjoy the full game without spending an extra dime, then I'm not playing the game. And again, to this day there's only one free-to-play game with microtransactions that I will touch, and that's the aforementioned Warframe. And even its formula is hard to describe. The fact of the matter is that the reason microtransactions are making big news now is that gamers are a very picky bunch. No one game typically appeals to all gamers, and even the most well-crafted, story-intensive, loot-generous game will still fall to scrutiny of its own community. Gamers, myself included, are some of the hardest people on the planet to please, and with good reason. You see, again, games are something we don't need. They're something we do in our spare time or as a hobby or even try to make time to do because we enjoy them. The second you take the enjoyment out of a game for a player, you've lost that player. Everyone has a different limit of what it takes, but I can pinpoint the exact moment that caused me to stop playing each game I do, or the exact reason I refuse to play a certain kind of game. The loot box industry has become so intrusive and so heavy-handed in some games that even major game journalists are covering it non-stop, such as Assassin's Creed, which was once an awesome single-player experience. There's now memes around it on the internet simply because of the microtransactions the developers have implemented into it, though Assassin's Creed has had some issues before that, to be fair. The producer of Monster Hunter World just made huge news by announcing that the game would not have loot boxes in them. The fact that such an announcement in a loot-based game is big news, fan of the game or not, shows just how pathetic the AAA industry has become. Not only that, but I can guarantee that this announcement will drive a ton of players, new and old, to this game. The unsteady temperament of gamers, combined with the free market, will not only solve this problem for us, but make the idea of a game having loot boxes so unappealing that anyone who even hints at a loot box system in their game will ensure that it not only sells like shit, but it may not even get released. I mean, I can go to Steam right now and download any number of awesome games with tons of content, community support, mods, loot, etc. of any genre for a lot less than these AAA games cost. In fact, I'd say that right now is a great time for indie developers because so many people are getting turned off by the AAA industry and their practices. And honestly, I see a huge crash coming, and indie games will be the main, if not the only game in town for a while. And let's be honest here, these AAA games with loot boxes are only getting away with it right now because they're shoving them into huge titles that have a ton of advertising or in long-standing, well-loved series. Any new game coming out with loot boxes at this point will likely not do too well here very soon. You see, we're getting burnt out real fast on this topic. Every week we hear about a new game and the first question we're asking is, are there loot boxes in it? Now, my biggest hope right now is that the worst offenders of loot boxes and microtransactions do this. They make these patents for loot boxes, hedging all their hopes in the system. They charge other companies to use the system, and they rely on them as well. I want them to ensure no other companies can use loot boxes or microtransactions in their games without paying a hefty price, and I want them to do it soon. I'm looking at you, Activision and EA. Then, once these companies have a corner on the market, and all their games are using these patented systems, the free market gives them the middle finger, and all their games tank. Should that happen, not only will we not have to worry about loot crates and microtransactions anymore, but these shitty companies would have legally ensured no other company could use this system. What a beautiful dream. Although at the rate Activision is going, this may become a reality. So, I guess my point in all of this is that no, loot boxes are not here to stay, at least not in their current form. The free market and the internet is already going nuts over this topic, and people are already starting to abandon these games and follow this model. It's true that many huge titles have sold fairly well recently, even with loot boxes, but let's look at upcoming new IPs and even long-standing franchises. Destiny 2 took a huge hit, and have already lost millions to their player base. Many never to return no matter what Bungie does to improve or fix the game, loot boxes or no. At this point, the only people who don't know about Battlefront 2's pay-to-win model is people who don't pay attention to the game in general. Anthem, the upcoming game from EA, if it's full of loot boxes in any capacity, I can guarantee that by the time it releases, they'll have almost nothing for a player base. You see, the same people who keep up with these new releases and gaming news in general are also paying attention to whether or not games will have loot boxes at this point, just as a general practice. And while the game may look interesting enough, if not entirely original, If this is another example of a potentially good game tainted by loot crates, then I, along with many other players, won't be buying Anthem. The fact that loot crates are all over gaming news has essentially ensured that gamers such as myself are on the lookout for games that contain them, along with other microtransactions. At the first sign of a loot crate, we're picking up and moving on and away from these games, more and more. The only way that developers will be able to get away with these practices in the future is to introduce them mid-game after people have already bought the game, or to keep it under wraps and not announce that the game will have them until after release. In these cases, it's going to be even more imperative that players seek refunds for games such as these immediately after discovery, as well as for journalists to inform the community about these games as soon as they're discovered. So, enjoy your loot crates while you can, AAA industry. There's a storm coming from the gaming community, and when it's over, you'll be lucky to be left standing with 1 or 2 IPs left. From here on in, you and your games will be under more scrutiny than ever, and gamers rarely forget or forgive.